All right, get ready because we're about to take a deep dive into a case that's, well, it's both fascinating and really, really disturbing.
Yeah, definitely.
We're going all the way back to the early 1900s to Atlanta, a city that was kind of like booming with growth, but also dealing with some really intense racial tensions.
Right.
And it's during this time that a series of brutal murders just completely terrorized the black community and left behind a mystery that remains unsolved even to this day.
And what I think makes this case even more interesting, well, besides that it's unsolved, is the way the victims were actually killed.
Oh, yeah.
The violence was just so brutal, the sheer brutality. It immediately kind of makes you think of Jack the Ripper, right?
Yeah, I see what you mean. The Ripper thing always kind of brings up that image,
Mm.
that
Yeah,
feeling of dread and all that.
definitely.
But before we get too far into all of that, maybe we should like set the scene. We're talking about Atlanta between 1909 and 1914. So what was life like back then, particularly for the black community?
Well, so this was like right in the middle of the Jim Crow era.
Right.
It was a time of segregation, discrimination, you name it.
Oh,
Black people were constantly facing threats of violence. They had very few opportunities. And the justice system, well, let's just say it didn't exactly have their backs.
yeah. Not a great time.
No, not at all. And all of that really, it's essential to understanding the fear that was so widespread in the community during this time when the Atlanta Ripper was, active.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So let's talk about the victims now.
Okay.
We know that there were at least 15 women, and maybe even more, who were killed by the Ripper. So what can you tell us about them?
Well, all of the victims were Black or dark-skinned women, and most were in their early 20s.
What?
And it's kind of interesting because the newspapers back then described them as being good-looking and neatly dressed, and a lot of them were even educated, which, that was a really big deal back then for Black women, especially given how difficult it was for them to even get an education.
Yeah, for sure.
So you have to wonder if maybe, just maybe, the killer was targeting them for a specific reason.
Right. Because they were seen as doing well.
Yeah.
Like if they were perceived as like successful within their community, could that have made them a target? Maybe someone they knew, someone who moved in the same circles was jealous or something?
Yeah, totally. It's definitely a possibility. The thing is, you can tell a lot about a killer's motives just by looking at who they choose as victims.
Yeah, that's true.
So in this case, it really makes you think, was the killer driven by some kind of personal grudge, or was it something bigger? Was it like a manifestation of this hatred that existed in society at the time?
I mean, that kind of leads into my next question about the murders themselves. We've kind of touched on it at the bit, but the way these women were murdered was absolutely brutal. We're talking slashing, ripping, tearing, like it was just a frenzy of violence.
Exactly, and that's kind of the point, right? This
Yeah.
wasn't just about killing someone. The level of violence suggests that there was something else going on, something more psychological, a need not just to kill, but to dehumanize and inflict as much pain as possible.
Right, yeah.
And we've seen that in other Ripper-type cases where the brutality is way more than what's needed to simply end a life.
Yeah, for sure. One case that really stands out is Lena Sharp.
Oh, yes.
She was 40 years old, and the sources we looked at describe her as being found with her head almost completely severed.
That's awful.
Yeah, I know. It's a lot.
That's definitely the detail that really cements the whole Ripper label,
Oh, right.
I mean, the brutality, the fact that it was almost surgical in a way, it mirrors the crimes of Jack the Ripper back in London. So you can definitely see why the Atlanta press at the time, why they latched onto that name. It got everyone's attention and just completely amplified the fear that was already surrounding this case.
And that fear, it must have been really intense. Like, can you imagine being a black woman in Atlanta during this time?
Oh, totally.
You're already facing the threat of violence, discrimination everywhere you turn, and then this starts happening. Like you said, you can't even understand this case without factoring in that fear.
Absolutely. There are stories from back then about Black women who were so afraid that they wouldn't go out alone at night.
Wow.
And there were Black people who worked service jobs who were like absolutely refusing to work after dark.
It's crazy how the fear itself just becomes such a huge part of the story.
It does, and it definitely added to the pressure that the authorities were feeling to catch this guy.
For sure. So given that this was the early 1900s and forensic science was still, pretty limited, did the investigators have any leads to work with?
Well, they looked into 6 different suspects, but they never actually convicted anyone. And you have to remember, this was like the very beginning of the 1900s. Fingerprinting was a new thing. DNA analysis wasn't even a concept yet.
Right.
So investigators were basically stuck with eyewitness accounts and whatever circumstantial evidence they could find.
I mean, it's hard to imagine trying to solve a case like this without DNA evidence.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It's like playing Clue in the dark.
Totally. And even something like fingerprinting, which, is considered pretty advanced at the time, it wasn't
Mhm.
nearly as reliable as it is now. The techniques were still being developed, and there weren't any databases to compare fingerprints to.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, I remember reading something about an eyewitness account from the daughter of one of the victims. I think she survived an attack, if I'm remembering correctly.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Her testimony was like the biggest piece of evidence they had back then.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, she described the attacker as a large, powerfully built black man who was always dressed very neatly.
Okay, so that sounds like a pretty detailed description. Why wasn't it enough to catch him?
Well, here's the thing about eyewitness testimony.
Hmm.
You can't always rely on it, especially when someone has been through a traumatic experience like that.
Right.
When you're under that much stress, your memory can be fuzzy, details get mixed up or exaggerated, and sometimes, your own biases can even affect what you remember. So it's not always the most reliable thing to base an entire investigation on.
Yeah, that makes sense, especially in a case like this. And in this particular case, it sounds like that description, while it seems helpful, could have also led the investigators in the wrong direction.
Oh, for sure.
Because it kind of plays into these stereotypes about black men and violence,
Oh, exactly.
which could have totally clouded their judgment.
Totally. And, we have to remember this was a time when racism was just everywhere.
Oh, yeah.
It was baked into every part of society, especially law enforcement.
Right.
So, yeah, it's very likely that the investigation was influenced by all those prejudices and assumptions about black people.
So we have these brutal murders, a terrified community, and on top of all of that, a potentially flawed investigation. What about the killer's motive? Do we have any theories about that?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? Why would someone do something like this?
Yeah,
The
exactly.
sources we looked at don't really give us any definitive answers, but I think we can at least try to explore some possibilities by looking at the patterns, the victims, and the nature of the attacks.
Okay, so let's put on our detective hats for a second and see if we can come up with some potential explanations for these horrific acts.
All right, let's do it.
Okay, so what do you think?
Well, one possibility is that this was about hatred towards women. Maybe the killer had this deep-seated hatred specifically for black women.
Mm-hmm.
And, that could have come from personal experiences, from messed up interpretations of what society was telling him, or even both.
So we're talking misogyny, maybe even fueled by the racial prejudice that was so rampant back then.
Exactly. I mean, all of the victims were black women.
Right.
So that points to a very specific kind of rage. It's possible that the killer saw these women as easy targets, as representatives of a group he felt he was better than, or that he wanted to punish somehow.
It's a disturbing thought, but it makes sense given the context of the time. And then there's the brutality of the murders. That's another thing that really gets to me. He was trying to send a message or something.
Yeah, that's another possible interpretation. All that violence, the mutilation, it could have been his way of asserting power and dominance. He wanted to instill fear, not just in the black community, but in society as a whole.
That's a really good point. I'm curious to get your take on this. Could the motive have been something more personal, or was it purely about racial hatred?
Well, it's hard to say for sure without knowing more about the killer. Some serial killers are all about power and control. Others are driven by sadism, and some are driven by a mix of all kinds of things.
Right.
So it's possible that the Atlanta Ripper's motives were more complicated than just racial hatred.
Right.
There could have been other things going on, like personal demons, past trauma, or abuse that warped his view of women.
Right, so it adds another layer of complexity to the case.
Yeah.
It's not just about figuring out who the killer was, but about trying to understand the psychology behind these acts.
Exactly, and that's what makes cases like this so fascinating, but also so frustrating. We end up with way more questions than answers.
Yeah, for sure. And the fact that he was never caught, does that tell us something about the killer? Does it suggest that he was clever and deliberate about trying to evade capture?
Absolutely. Think about it. He was able to operate for years without getting caught.
Right.
That tells me he was smart, he knew the city well enough to blend in, and he was able to take advantage of the weaknesses in the police investigation. He knew what he was doing.
So we're not just dealing with a violent person, but with a predator who was calculated and knew how to disappear.
Exactly. And this is where the lack of modern forensics really hurts.
Yeah.
Can you imagine if they had DNA analysis back then? They might have been able to connect the dots, find the killer, and give the victim's family some peace.
Speaking of connecting the dots, Do you think it's possible that the Atlanta Ripper's crimes could be linked to other unsolved murders from that time?
Oh, yeah. It's definitely a possibility. I mean, we know that crimes against marginalized communities were often ignored or just brushed aside.
Right, yeah.
So, yeah, it's totally conceivable that there are other murders out there, cases that were never properly connected to the Atlanta Ripper simply because the victims were Black and considered less important by the authorities. It's a very real possibility.
So there could be a whole bunch of unsolved cases out there just waiting to be discovered.
It's a scary thought, but it's not out of the question. And this is where modern forensic techniques could really make a difference. With things like DNA analysis, we could re-examine those old cases and finally connect the dots.
Right. It's like a historical jigsaw puzzle with all these missing pieces scattered throughout time.
Exactly. And with each new piece that we find, we get a clearer picture of the past, of the injustices that happened, and of the victims whose stories deserve to be told.
It's kind of amazing to think that even after all these years, a case like this can still just,
Mhm.
really capture our attention.
I know, right? It's
It
fascinating.
says a lot about how much we love a good mystery, but it also kind of makes us think about some of the not so great things from our past. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. This isn't just about some murders. It's a reflection of a society that was dealing with racism, sexism, and a justice system that didn't do a great job protecting people.
And I think that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. It's not just about like the cold hard facts of the case. It's about trying to understand the historical context, the things that were happening in society at the time, and, the human stories that get lost sometimes.
Right, exactly. And it makes you wonder if maybe there are other cases out there, like the Atlanta Ripper, that have been completely forgotten or ignored because the victims were Black.
It's a pretty disturbing thought, and unfortunately, it's probably true. But even though there's a lot of darkness surrounding this case, there's also a little bit of hope. What if we could use all of the advances in forensic technology to finally solve this mystery? Do you think we can use things like DNA analysis to identify the Atlanta Ripper after all this time?
I don't think it's impossible. It's going to be tough because, you know, any evidence from back then might not be in good shape anymore.
Right.
But there's always a chance that something could be tested again using the technology we have now. And even if we can't say for sure who the killer was, new evidence might link him to other unsolved crimes, or at least give us a better understanding of how he operated and why.
Yeah, it's like you were saying earlier.
Yeah.
Every time we find a new piece of the puzzle, we get a clearer picture, not just of the case, but of the history that surrounds it.
Exactly.
And for the families of the victims, even a small piece of information could give them some peace, some sense that justice has been served after all these years.
Absolutely. These were people with families and friends. Their lives were cut short, and their stories deserve to be heard.
Yeah, well said. For anyone listening who wants to learn more about this case, we've put together a list of sources in the show notes.
Oh, that's a great idea.
Yeah, so check those out if you're interested in digging deeper into the history, the investigations, and the theories surrounding the Atlanta Ripper. It's a fascinating case, for sure.
And don't forget, as you're looking into all of this, remember that history isn't just a bunch of facts. It's a mix of good and bad, of happy times and sad times, of voices that have been silenced and stories that are still waiting to be told. By understanding the past, we can figure out how to move forward in the present and hopefully create a future where everyone is treated fairly and with respect.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
And maybe with more research and a real commitment to finding the truth, even the toughest mysteries like the Atlanta Ripper can finally be solved. So until next time, keep asking questions, keep exploring, and never stop looking for the answers that are hidden in the past.